Hello and welcome along to this week's Liverpool.com podcast. I'm your host for this week, Matt Addison. James Martin is away for the week, so I've got Tom Beattie alongside me. Before we get stuck into some transfer chat, to get the best discount off your NordVPN plan, go to nordvpn.com/bloodred. Our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link is in the podcast description box below. Moving on though, Tom, we're going to talk a little bit about transfers. We know how much Reds fans love getting stuck into those. They are, as it's been said so many times, the only club as it stands in the Premier League not to have made a new signing this summer. But it's an interesting time, isn't it? There's been a little bit of chat around Anthony Gordon and some Joe Gomez news that has emerged this morning. Liverpool by no means are desperate to move Joe Gomez on. I think it would take a substantial offer, I think it's fair to say. But let's start with Anthony Gordon first, because we've kind of known about that for a little bit longer. Is that a player, a name that would excite you in terms of this summer for Liverpool?
Yeah, I think obviously like a lot of fans, I think when the first kind of rumours came through just before the PSR deadline, I was interested to see how it was going to play out. So obviously he's a player, I think last season particularly, I was really impressed with him. I think he got 10 goals and 10 assists, didn't he? So he's kind of showing numbers, particularly in the past year, which would suggest, I think, that he's en route to becoming sort of one of the best attackers in the league. I think particularly with his age and obviously the link with Liverpool as well, having grown up on Merseyside, I think, that should hopefully be kind of a good mix, I think, for Liverpool if we were able to get him. But yeah, there just seems to be a couple of stumbling blocks, I think, doesn't there? Not least to do with Newcastle wanting to keep him as well, because obviously I think there will be a lot of clubs who'd be circling around Anthony Gordon off the back of last season as well. But it does look like Liverpool are kind of the front runners as well. So yeah, it's an interesting link, that one. I'm kind of hoping from a fan's perspective that there's something in it. And yeah, the details that kind of came through recently about obviously the Joe Gomez stuff as well, it is really interesting. But yeah, I think it's definitely one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think it's definitely fair to say that Liverpool have got an interest in him. It was a player that's obviously been in the Premier League for a while now, but like you say, he's kind of exploded a little bit last season in terms of those goal-scoring numbers and being consistent. He's a player that's only 23 as well. It ticks a lot of boxes for me in terms of looking at what Liverpool look for in the age, the final third, the fact that he's quick, he's caused Liverpool problems as well in the past. It's interesting, I think, as well in terms of his contract situation. Obviously signed in January 18 months ago, but the reporting around it seems to suggest that his contract runs until 2026. I've had a little bit of a look into that and couldn't see anything really that suggested otherwise. The fact that he only signed a 3.5-year deal, I think, is interesting in itself when he went to Newcastle. But to me, that makes it even more likely that Liverpool will be interested, because let's say Newcastle are digging their heels in, they don't want to sell the player this summer. A year down the line or even 2 years down the line, if he was to go on a free transfer, not necessarily saying that would be the case, but even if that happened, he would only be 25. It kind of feels like one that Liverpool might have to be a little bit patient, but if they want him, it certainly sounds like it might be realistic.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like it's going to kind of simmer on this one. And like you say, with the contract situation, I was a bit like yourself, a little bit surprised that the contract was that short. And yeah, again, it's kind of difficult to say really whether it'll get done this summer. But yeah, I agree. I think it's a player that eventually, it would be someone that I think, could end up at Anfield. And I think that, like you said before, kind of his playing style, that direct kind of approach that he's got, I think that would really excite the fans as well. I think hopefully that'll fit in quite well with what Arne Slot's kind of trying to do at Liverpool as well. Obviously it's kind of leading off how Jurgen Klopp used to set up and kind of putting his own spin on that as well. So yeah, he's definitely a player I think that would excite me in terms of a prospect. But yeah, whether it's this summer or maybe next year or maybe even the one after, we'll have to see.
Yeah, I think it's always exciting when you see a player do well against Liverpool. He had a couple of good games for Everton against Liverpool. They obviously caused Liverpool problems at St James's Park almost 12 months ago now as well. But I think those performances do stick in the memory for fans. You mentioned Joe Gomez before. We'll talk a little bit about him as well. There was a suggestion a week or so, or probably more than a week ago now, that Jarell Quansah had been part of discussions. Obviously, Liverpool were never ever going to think about something along those lines in terms of losing him. It sounds like a deal was sort of proposed, which might have seen Joe Gomez valued at about 45 million and maybe Anthony Gordon around 75, and essentially a swap deal, even though it would be two separate deals for PSR reasons, was proposed. I mean, I suppose my initial reaction to that was that maybe if, as the Daily Mail has reported today as we record, Joe Gomez wants guaranteed minutes at centre-back. On the one hand, you can kind of see why he might have to go somewhere else for that to be the case, but he played a lot of football, didn't he, for Liverpool last season? It would be a big loss, and I think it would take a big, substantial fee for Liverpool to want to get rid of him.
Yeah, I think he's been a kind of integral part of the squad, hasn't he, for a good number of years now, and obviously the longest-serving player, I think, left at Liverpool. And yeah, like you say, last season, he obviously coming in at left-back at times, and he's also that option at centre-back in terms of his kind of experience as well, which, it is invaluable, I think, at that level. So, yeah, he's an asset, really, I think, within the squad. He's a player that, yeah, I'd be kind of loath to kind of lose him, really, because I think, what he offers in terms of that experience, like I say, and sort of his quality as well in terms of on the ball. Obviously, playing out from the back has become more and more important in the modern game, and he's a player who's very comfortable with that as well. So yeah, he's a player that I'd be sad to see go if he was to leave Liverpool. But yeah, I think Richard Hughes, that it's a good sign really if them valuations were what he was looking at. I think it is a lot of money, 45 million for a player that has been a backup at times for Liverpool, and obviously a player that as well has struggled with injuries at times. So yeah, he does have a market value, and obviously at 27 as well. You do look at that maybe and say that he's a player that if someone has to go this summer, you possibly be looking at somebody with a valuation that's quite high, so you can reinvest in other areas. But yeah, I think that it's an interesting one. For me, he's a player I'd want to keep around just in terms of what he can offer to the squad. But yeah, it's intriguing to see that, potentially there was a deal on the table there, albeit that it never got over the line.
Yeah, I think from Liverpool's perspective, it's safe to say that they would want to keep him. It's certainly not the case that they're sort of touting him around or anything like that. This was obviously a few weeks ago that these talks happened, a month ago or just over a month ago now, because it was that June 30th deadline, wasn't it, for the PSR? So it is interesting. It'll be interesting to see if any more developments happen on that. But obviously, at this moment in time, at least, it doesn't look like there necessarily will be. There is possibly a decision to make for him. But we'll move on to a different area of the pitch. Central midfield, obviously, is something that we've spoken a lot about. We spent most of last summer discussing central midfielders, but not necessarily holding midfielders, Wataru Endo aside, who at the time we didn't know a great deal about, I think it's fair to say. And we know now that a year on, Liverpool have rejected an offer from Marseille for him. I'm not quite sure how recent that was. It could have been a couple of weeks or so ago, but I think that was probably for most people a position that they'd want to strengthen as well, centre-back and holding midfield. Were they the two priorities for you heading into the summer? And what do you sort of make of the Endo rejected bid and all of that sort of thing, really, in terms of how that's played out?
Yeah, it kind of caught me on the wares a little bit, the Endo link to Marseille. I think he's a player in terms of, again, his experience where I'd be wanting to keep him around the squad for the next couple of years. Obviously, I think he signed a long-term deal only last summer. I think he was pretty promising in that first year. So yeah, I was a little bit surprised to see, obviously, that there was that report that Marseille had come in for him. But yeah, I think it is long-term a position that I think most fans would be saying, it is a position we're going to have to be strengthening in. Obviously, he's, I think, 32 or coming up to that age. So yeah, long-term, I think we're going to have to find a solution in that position. But yeah, I think the other kind of point aside from that as well is obviously I think the new manager would be a little bit wary about stifling the development of Stefan Bajcetic as well. Obviously, he showed so much promise in the games he has played for Liverpool over the last couple of seasons, albeit last season was curtailed by injury. But I think he'll be looking forward to, working with him and seeing what he's got on his hands in terms of a talent. Because I think he showed enough kind of attributes in the performances that I've seen him play to suggest that he could be a real star for Liverpool. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting dilemma for obviously, Richard Hughes and Michael Edwards to kind of look at this summer. And yeah, like you say, the centre-back question. I think the interest in Lenny Yoro, who ended up at Man United, that kind of indicated that, possibly they were looking at, strengthening that position. And obviously with the loss of Joel Matip as well, I think that will be a loss for Liverpool next season, and he'll be a tough man to replace, I think, again, in terms of experience and just kind of what he offered over the 5 or 6 years he was at Liverpool as well. So yeah, they're kind of the two positions I was looking at coming into the summer. That's kind of why Anthony Gordon kind of caught me a little bit unawares as well, because obviously we are kind of well stocked in that position, obviously with Luis Diaz and Gakpo as well. But yeah, let's say centre back and the number 6, I think long term are the two positions I'd be looking at strengthening in.
We'll come back to the centre backs in a second, but just in terms of that holding midfield position as well, obviously there's no guarantee or maybe not even a feeling that Liverpool would want to move Endo on this summer necessarily, but obviously we know that there's been a bid there that suggests that there's been some sort of encouragement from some party somewhere to sort of come to that point. But I suppose even before we talked about Endo potentially moving on, there was still a need, I think, if there was one out there, for Liverpool to go and get a real top-class holding midfielder. I think Liverpool has pretty much given away that that's what they would want to do as well, given, Aurelien Tchouameni going back a little bit of time. Obviously, they went big for Moises Caicedo. I think it's probably safe to say one of the reasons that they ended up with Endo last summer was because there isn't really a great deal of other options available to them. So I suppose where do you sort of stand on how much of a need there is in holding midfield for Liverpool? Is it a case of they've got to get one, or do they have to wait and maybe get an elite option when one comes available, even if that might not be this summer, might not be next summer either?
Yeah, it's something I've thought about coming into the summer, because obviously the leading kind of competition in the Premier League, at least, is with Man City and Arsenal, and I'd say they probably got two of the best holding midfielders in the world at the moment, in Rodri and obviously Declan Rice as well. But on the other hand, I think that we did kind of do pretty well, I think, without that kind of, elite level number 6 last season. We did find solutions in that area. Obviously, Alexis McAllister stepped back into that role kind of first half of the season. Eventually, Endo obviously came in as well. I do think we kind of made it work. Obviously, the wheels came off a little bit in the last kind of 10 games of the season in the league, but I think that there was a lot of promise there. And it could be a case of, like you say, waiting for the right person to come along. Obviously, there was links with Addison, I think, at Atalanta. They've kind of gone cold a little bit. There's a couple of players out there I've kind of looked at as well. Adam Wharton at Crystal Palace as well, but it might be a case, like you say, of waiting for that right player to come along. I think, unfortunately, the right player maybe went to Arsenal last summer. I think he was always destined to stay in London. So, yeah, I guess it's kind of like the centre-forward question for a lot of clubs at the moment. Getting that specialist centre-forward in, obviously, is a tricky ordeal for clubs as well at the other end of the pitch. So, yeah, I think long-term, I think we definitely need a solution in that position, to kind of compete consistently with the likes of Man City and Arsenal. But I think equally, we have showed evidence last season that we can cope without an elite level player in that position. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to see kind of what, the recruitment team choose to do this summer, I think.
Yeah, I think for me, I think I might be a bit of an outlier in terms of this, but if Alexis McAllister was to play the entirety of next season in that position, to me, that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. I think most teams, probably 95% of the matches that Liverpool play, that's absolutely fine. I think maybe you'd be worried going away to City or away to Arsenal with him in that position, but even then, Liverpool have done that in the past and have been able to compete for portions of the game, if not, go and get the result. So I don't know where do you stand on Alexis McAllister? Because for me, to try and get Elliott, Szoboszlai, Curtis Jones, McAllister, all of these players into that midfield, one of them is going to have to play the holding position. Otherwise, it's that or somebody sits out. To me, McAllister feels like the one where you can put him in there. Maybe it's not his favoured position, but I don't know where do you stand with McAllister when he comes back? Is he the solution for the time being, or is he one that you want to see a little bit further forward?
I think the interesting thing with him is that I think he is an elite level footballer, and I think that he is very adaptable as well. So he's obviously showed that for Brighton, obviously in his first season for us as well, and with Argentina. I think he is a player that, like you say, I'd be relying on just in terms of kind of experience, I think. And, he did show a lot of promise, I think, in that position last season. There's obviously a couple of games, I think, where, he was caught under the ball a little bit. But I think that, in terms of the options that you mentioned there, I think he's probably the best on the ball. And actually, getting the ball from the goalkeeper and that sort of aspect of that position as well. I think he's very comfortable in doing that. So, yeah, he's a player I really trust, I'd say. Pretty much in every position in that midfield. So, yeah, out of them names, I'd say he's certainly the player I'd be going for. The other one's obviously Curtis Jones as well, where I think there is promise there. Again, in terms of kind of his footballing ability, I know he played that for the under-21s for England at times. I know they had some success with that as well. So I think there is kind of something to work with there maybe for the new manager as well. And obviously Curtis was speaking about the new manager and sort of the impression that he's made on him early on, sort of in the role. So yeah, that could be something that they kind of work on in training as well. But yeah, I do think we kind of have a couple of options there already, which, looking at the market at the moment, you mentioned Moises Caicedo before. I think he went for over 100 million. Obviously Declan Rice, I think, went for 100 million. So a specialist in that position isn't going to come cheap. And yet we did kind of soldier on, didn't we, last season? I think we've kind of found new solutions in that position. So yeah, it might be one that kind of we address maybe in the next couple of summers rather than right away, I'd say.
Yeah, I think my only concern really with McAllister isn't really about the position. It's just about the amount of football that he's played. He's obviously gone away this summer. He's going to have under 2 weeks, I think, by the time he comes back between then and the start of the new season. I think he's pretty much played consistently without a rest since probably the start of the season where they went and won the World Cup. He was obviously a key player there as well for Argentina. He's played pretty much ever since. So I think that's probably my biggest worry really, is that you don't want to overplay him as much as he was quite possibly Liverpool's player of the season last season. It would be a shame to see him pick up a little injury or maybe go off the boil just because of that sort of thing. But anyway, talking about having enough options, let's move on to the centre-backs. Obviously, we mentioned Joe Gomez already. We've spoken a little bit about him and sort of his future. Sepp Berg as well is another one that is to be discussed. He's obviously drawn interest. Liverpool have put a £20 million price tag on his head, which I think we've discussed a few times on this podcast. It does feel maybe slightly on the high side, but then again, there is interest from enough clubs to make you think possibly that Liverpool might get something close to that for him. But it's a difficult balancing act, isn't it? I think he's pretty much made it clear in the case of Sepp that he would like regular first team football next season. I don't know about you, but I don't really think that that's realistic if he stays at Liverpool.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of options in that position, like you say. Obviously, with Joel Matip going, we've kind of lost an elite level centre-back there, I'd say. But yeah, there's a lot of players in that position at the moment, and particularly with the emergence of Jarell Quansah as well. That's kind of given the manager something else to think about in terms of his development. But yeah, I think Berg seems to be kind of on the fringes at the moment. With the likes of Nat Phillips. So it'd be interesting to see kind of again what Liverpool choose to do. I think with players like that, I think the game's kind of gone that way now, particularly in terms of the PSR question, for example. Them more kind of homegrown players, if you can make a profit on them. As cynical as that sounds, that seems to be kind of the way the clubs are kind of balancing the books at the moment. And yeah, I guess that he could be a player if you can get closer to that valuation of 20 million. That could be a deal that works for both parties ultimately. So yeah, I have a bit of sympathy for him in some respects, because obviously he's come over as a young player. But yeah, I think ultimately he's going to struggle to get first team games or game time at Liverpool. So yeah, the best solution might actually lay elsewhere for him. But yeah, like you say, there's a lot of players at the moment who are fighting essentially over one place next to Virgil van Dijk at the heart of the defence. So yeah, I think he's maybe at the back of the queue, unfortunately. So yeah, I wouldn't be too surprised if a deal was struck at some point for him to leave ultimately. So yeah.
Yeah, we're recording this before the Arsenal pre-season friendly, so we've not actually seen loads of Liverpool in pre-season so far as we record this podcast. But what have you made of Sepp van den Berg? I think a few people were impressed with him. He looks, physically maybe a little bit developed, as you'd expect, having gone out on loan a couple of times. He's obviously not a teenager like he was when he first came in. He looked very, very young and very raw. But I think for me that the limitation with him lies possibly on the ball. Is he maybe at the level of Quansah or a Van Dijk? And obviously we know how important that's going to be for Arne Slot. So what have you sort of made of him so far from the limited amounts that we've seen of him? If he was to stay and be, say, the fifth choice centre-back for Liverpool, would that be something that you were happy with? Where's your sort of where's your judgment at in terms of Sepp at this moment in time?
I think there's certainly talent there, and I can tell why he was identified at a young age. Obviously, he played first team football as a teenager, and obviously he's come over to England and obviously had a few loan deals since then. I think he went out to Germany, didn't he, the past couple of seasons, Schalke and Mainz. I think he went to Preston before that as well. So he's played a lot of football, I think, for somebody, I think, in his early 20s now. But yeah, like you say, I think there's a couple of limitations in terms of sort of on the ball. I think he has filled out a bit, in fairness to him, since I've seen him last in a Liverpool shirt. I do actually think he'll go on and have a really good career. But yeah, they just might seem, things haven't quite lined up for him in terms of, that route into the first team. I think sometimes it is a bit of luck and fortune as well. I think, looking at Quansah last season, a couple of injuries, Joel Matip got injured, and everything kind of lined up for him. So yeah, there could be an option there, obviously, if Nat Phillips was to go, and maybe even the Joe Gomez question, maybe that does open up then, the possibility for him to stay. But yeah, I think in terms of the interest in him as well, it might be the player wants to, ultimately, go away and gain more kind of game time and stuff, which I can understand as well. So yeah, that's a difficult one. I think as a player, he's somebody that, I think will have a good career in the game. But yeah, whether that will be with Liverpool or elsewhere, I think time will tell.
Yeah, I think he's definitely a player that you can see having a good future. The fact that so many clubs are interested in him, PSV potentially, for them, what would be a club record fee? I think that probably tells you everything you need to know really about how much he impressed. Certainly last season when he was with Mainz, one of the better defenders certainly in that part of the Bundesliga. So it'd be interesting to see what happens. But yeah, I think we're both in agreement. It probably makes sense for him to move on if Liverpool can get something close to that valuation. But let's just finish off then with a talk about the contracts. We seem to have this conversation fairly regularly. Obviously, there's not really been any updates in terms of Trent, Mohamed Salah and Virgil van Dijk. We won't go over old ground in terms of each of those players, but I do think it's interesting that we've got to this point in the summer and there's not really been too much in the way of updates in terms of any of those players, really. Obviously, a couple of them are still away on holidays and aren't back yet. Are you expecting negotiations for all three of them? Would you keep all three of them beyond the next summer when the contract expires? What's your sort of take on it at this moment in time?
I think it's almost as though Salah and Van Dijk fit into one category, and then I think Trent has kind of been another one, because obviously he's entering into his prime years. I think he's 26 now. Obviously, the other two are in the early 30s, so it does kind of leave a question with them too. I think in terms of the long term structure of the club, in terms of the contract situation, both of them will be on high wages, I'd say. In terms of a renewal. So yeah, I think it's an interesting one with them too. Ultimately, I think that they're still high performing players. I think two of the best in their position in the league, if not the best, in terms of the numbers. So there's been no real signs of drop off, I think, from the two of them. Salah, I think at times last season looked a bit tired after the African Cup of Nations, but I think that's only to be expected. After picking up an injury, I think he couldn't quite get into his stride after that, sort of the back end of last season. But I think, for me, they're two players that I'd be looking to hold on to still. I think they're still elite players, and the experience they've got as well, I think, is invaluable. And then I think with Trent, I am a little bit surprised that it's got to this point, particularly with him, with a player of his quality, and I think sort of his status as well. I think most of us presume that he'd be the next captain at Liverpool, and I still think he will be. I think that hopefully a deal will be struck. I think, as fans, we all kind of get drawn in sometimes. You see that the pictures of him with Jude Bellingham on holiday and stuff like that, but I think there's nothing in that, obviously, other than being best friends, basically. So yeah, I don't think, hopefully the Real Madrid links, I don't think that there's much in them. I think he will ultimately stay at Liverpool. I'm pretty certain in my own mind. So yeah, hopefully a deal will be struck on that. I think with the other two, it might just be a case of, whether it comes down to money, whether it's, the right kind of move for, players of that kind of, age bracket as well. I think it does kind of beg a question with the two of them, whether we look down a more long-term route or whether, we stick with what we've got. So yeah, I am a little bit surprised in some respects, particularly with Trent, that it's gone on this long. But I do have sympathy as well, because I think that obviously, Jörg Schmadtke left, I think, sort of midway through last season. We've waited for Richard Hughes to kind of get his foot in the door. And I think hopefully things are going on in the background in terms of contracts and that sort of thing. But yeah, the thing is, from a fan's perspective, I think most people will be hoping that, all three of them basically sign the dotted line. But yeah, I think, again, time will tell with all three of them, I'd say.
Yeah, I'm in agreement really with you. I think it's important that Liverpool have the conversations. I'm sure those will happen at some point if they haven't already begun behind the scenes. And I mean, just in particular with Salah, he's obviously the one that we've seen so far in pre-season. He's looked really, really sharp. Again, comes with the caveat of, we've not seen the Arsenal game yet. Maybe people will be listening to this afterwards and maybe he's picked up an injury. I don't know, but it's one of those where I think from what we've seen of him so far, the way that, he's looked, he's taken every opportunity to take his top off and show everyone those abs. So he certainly looks like he's in decent shape, and he's got a few years left at the top. And just a last word really on Salah before we finish. I thought it was interesting that even when Liverpool didn't have a central striker in the Real Betis game, obviously Diogo Jota is now back with the squad, but in that game I thought it was interesting that Salah played wide and not through the middle. I think there was maybe a school of thought that he might play a little bit more centrally once he gets a little bit older, but to me that is just another sign really that Liverpool have to get the new contract sorted, because if they still think he's quick enough and fast enough to play on the wing, rather than having to move into a more kind of a more kind of not restricted but sort of static role almost because of his lack of attributes physically, I think that, again, to me at least, just points towards him still having 3-4 years left at the top, in which case I'd very much like them to be at Liverpool.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, there's been a lot of examples as well as in the past kind of 5 or 6 years of elite level strikers who've been able to go on producing big numbers up until kind of the mid-30s. Obviously, Messi, Lewandowski, Benzema, Ronaldo. So there's a lot of players who've kind of, showed, it is possible to kind of adapt your game. Obviously, playing out wide, there is always that question of whether he'll have the legs, like you say, and to keep on doing it at that level. But yeah, I did think that was interesting as well, because there has been that question over whether he will drift into that number 10 role next season. So yeah, I think with all things considered, if he is the long-term solution, then I think we'll have to get a contract signed. So yeah, I think hopefully, from a fan's perspective again, that is getting done in the background. So yeah, we'll have to wait and see with that.
Yeah, absolutely. It could be an interesting few weeks. August the 30th is the transfer deadline. Obviously, Liverpool can do the contracts with those 3 players or any other players that they want to give new contracts to at any point. But I think it certainly should be interesting. It certainly feels like things are starting to hot up as well. I'm sure it won't be the last podcast dedicated to transfers between now and the end of next month as well. So, yes, as ever, we will keep you updated on Liverpool.com with all of the transfer updates. We've got a live blog running every day. We've got loads of different content around all the players that are linked with Liverpool and all the latest news as well on the Blood Red channel. But thank you very much to Tom for stepping onto the podcast again. It's good to speak to you, mate. And hopefully James Martin will be back next week and myself and him can go through a few more transfer links and maybe a few more developments as well. But in the meantime, thank you very much for listening. We'll leave it there for now. Goodbye.